The morning was barely awake when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Still tangled in sleep, I reached for it, expecting maybe a calendar reminder or a message from work. Instead, a strange number lit up the screen, and something in my chest tightened. With a groggy yawn, I pressed answer, my voice scratchy. On the other end, a woman's trembling voice whispered, "Are you Alice, Brandon's wife?" My stomach flipped like ice water had been poured straight through me. I shot upright in bed, every trace of sleep gone in an instant. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Yes, I am," I said, my throat dry. "Who's speaking?" The line crackled, carrying her uneven breath. Then came a muffled sob, raw and desperate. I can't say my name yet, but please, meet me today at 3 p.m. at the Brown Café. He's not who you think he is." Her words weren't just a request, they felt like a warning. For a moment, I couldn't even breathe. My mind raced, spinning through 100 questions I wasn't ready to face. Who was this woman? What did she mean about Brandon? I wanted to hang up, to erase the whole call and go back to pretending. But deep down, something told me I couldn't ignore this. Against all reason, I heard myself whisper, "All right." And with that single word, I stepped into a storm I didn't yet see coming. I sat there clutching the phone, staring at the dark screen long after the call ended. The room felt colder, like the walls themselves had overheard the conversation and were closing in on me. Brandon was still asleep beside me, his steady breathing almost mocking in its calmness. I studied his face, the man I thought I knew so well, and wondered if everything I believed about him had just been a lie. That woman's voice kept replaying in my head, shaky, broken, desperate for me to listen. Every instinct screamed that I should dismiss it, that it was probably some cruel joke or mistake, but my gut wouldn't let it go. There was something in her tone, an urgency too raw to fake. I thought back to the small moments I had brushed aside, the late nights, the vague excuses, the texts he hid when I walked into the room. Each memory now burned brighter, like scattered sparks suddenly forming a fire. Had I been blind, or had I just chosen not to see? My hands trembled as I set the phone down on the nightstand. I wanted answers, but fear coiled tight in my chest, making it hard to breathe. Who was she? What did she mean by, "He's not who you think he is"? The question gnawed at me, louder than the morning birds chirping outside the window. I knew I couldn't stay still. At 3 p.m., I'd be at that cafe. Whether I liked it or not, I had to hear the truth, straight from her lips. The rest of the morning passed in a haze. I moved through the motions, making coffee, folding laundry, even forcing a smile when Brandon kissed my cheek before leaving for work. But inside, I was unraveling. Every glance at the clock made my pulse quicken, dragging me closer to 3 o'clock. I couldn't decide if I wanted time to slow down or speed up, just to end the torment of waiting. By noon, my nerves had frayed to the point where even the smallest sound startled me. The kettle whistling, the mail sliding through the slot, the creak of the floorboards under my feet. It all felt amplified, like the universe was pushing me toward that meeting. I kept hearing her voice, trembling with fear, yet brave enough to call me. Why me? Why now? The questions clawed at my mind. When the clock finally struck 2, I grabbed my keys with shaky hands and headed out the door. The world outside looked unchanged. Sunny, calm, ordinary. But my life no longer felt ordinary at all. Driving to the Brown Café, I realized I was about to meet someone who held a piece of my marriage in her hands. I didn't know her face, her name, or her full story. But I knew one thing: whatever she revealed would change everything. At exactly 3 o'clock, I pushed open the glass door of the Brown Café, the bell above it chiming a little too cheerfully for the storm inside me. The warm scent of roasted coffee beans wrapped around me, but it did nothing to calm my nerves. My eyes scanned the room, darting from table to table, searching for someone, anyone, who might be waiting for me. Then I saw her, a young woman, visibly pregnant, sitting alone by the window with her hands folded tightly over her belly. When our eyes met, she gave a small, hesitant wave. My legs felt heavy as I crossed the room, each step echoing with dread. Sliding into the chair across from her, I noticed how pale she looked. Her eyes rimmed red as if sleep had been a stranger to her for days. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick, broken only by the clinking of cups and the low hum of chatter around us. Finally, she leaned forward, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry for this. I've been seeing Brandon for almost a year, and I'm carrying his child." Her words landed like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. I stared at her, shaking my head in disbelief. "No, you must be mistaken," I whispered, clinging to denial like a lifeline. "My husband would never—" The young woman's lip trembled as tears slid down her cheeks. She looked at me with such raw pain, I almost couldn't bear it. And in that moment, I realized denial wasn't going to save me. "I wish I was mistaken," she sobbed, her hands clutching the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. "But he knows, and instead of taking responsibility, he threatened me, said he'd ruin me if I ruined his life." Her words cracked under the weight of fear, and I felt my stomach twist into knots so tight it hurt to breathe. My husband, my Brandon, wasn't just unfaithful. He was cruel. The cafe around us blurred, voices and laughter fading into nothing but white noise. My chest ached, not only from betrayal but from the horrifying truth settling over me like a heavy cloak. I wanted to scream, to demand more proof, to run out the door and never look back. But her tears pulled me in, tethered me to her pain. She wasn't lying. Every quiver of her voice, every tremor in her hands spoke of a nightmare she had no power to escape. I wiped at the corner of my eyes, furious with myself for letting the tears fall. "So he wasn't just betraying me. He was trying to destroy you too." Saying it out loud made it real, more real than I wanted it to be. She nodded, covering her face with both hands as her shoulders shook. And there we were, two women bound by one man's deceit, drowning in different oceans of grief that somehow collided into one. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I just sat there, staring at this woman who had unknowingly become a mirror for my own heartbreak. Her swollen belly rose and fell with each shaky breath, proof of a life caught in the middle of a lie I never saw coming. My throat tightened, my voice barely a whisper. "So, he wasn't just unfaithful. He's a monster." She dropped her hands from her face and met my eyes, her own brimming with despair. "I never wanted this," she whispered. "I didn't plan for it, and I didn't expect him to be so heartless. But now I can't escape it. And I thought, maybe you, of all people, would understand." Her words dug deep, pulling me into her desperation, forcing me to see the truth I had been clinging to avoid. Brandon had built a world of lies around me, and I had been living in it, blind and trusting. The air between us shifted, heavy with grief, but also with an unspoken connection. Against all odds, our pain intertwined, weaving an unexpected thread of solidarity. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one thing. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something darker, something that would demand more from me than I ever imagined. Tears blurred my vision as I reached across the table, my fingers brushing against hers. It felt strange, touching the hand of the woman who had been with my husband, yet in that moment, she wasn't my enemy. She was just another woman broken by the same man who had shattered me. Her sobs grew heavier, and mine followed, until the sound of our grief blended together. Strangers yesterday, now bound by betrayal. "I know I'm guilty too," she whispered between sobs, her voice raw and small. "I shouldn't have done this, but I can't take his threats anymore." "Please, Alice, you're my last hope." Her words pierced me, leaving me torn between fury and compassion. The weight of her plea sat heavy on my chest, pressing me into a corner I never imagined I'd stand in. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, she was begging for survival. I drew in a shaky breath, my mind spiraling. My husband's mistress was asking me, his wife, to protect her. It sounded insane, like a cruel twist of fate. And yet, as her trembling hand clutched mine tighter, I couldn't shake the truth staring me in the face. She was terrified, and the only person who might truly understand the danger she was in was me. You're asking me, his wife, to defend you? The words slipped out before I could stop them, heavy with disbelief. My voice shook, not from anger, but from the sheer absurdity of it all. Her eyes filled with fresh tears as she nodded, her chin trembling. Yes, because you know what kind of man he is. You're the only one who truly does. Her honesty cut deeper than any insult ever could. I sat back in my chair, my breath uneven. The cafe noise faded into a dull hum, like the world had pressed pause while I wrestled with the impossible. Part of me wanted to walk away, to leave her with her guilt and my broken marriage. But another part, a stronger part, saw the fear etched into her face and recognized it. It was the same fear I had buried every time I ignored Brandon's excuses, the same fear I carried without even knowing. My hands trembled as I pulled them from hers, pressing them together in my lap. I didn't answer right away because the truth was, I didn't know if I could forgive her. But I did know one thing. Brandon's cruelty had cornered us both. And if I stayed silent, he would win again. I wasn't ready to decide, but deep down, the seeds of a dangerous resolve were already taking root. The silence stretched between us, heavy as lead. Finally, I lifted my gaze and saw her eyes, wide, pleading, carrying more fear than any woman should bear alone. Something inside me shifted. I realized this wasn't about choosing sides anymore. It was about stopping a man who had destroyed both of us in different ways. Slowly, I whispered, "Then I'll help you. Not for him. For us." The words surprised even me, but once spoken, they felt right. Her lips trembled as she covered her mouth, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Relief poured out of her like a flood, and she reached for my hands again, holding on as if I were her lifeline. I let her. For the first time since the call that morning, I felt a spark of control flicker back into my chest. Brandon thought he could play us against each other, but instead, he had handed us a weapon, the truth. As I sat there clutching her hand, I made a vow to myself, silent but fierce. I would protect her baby, but more than that, I would make him pay. Not just for me, not just for her. For every ounce of cruelty he thought he could get away with. I didn't know how yet, but I knew this was the beginning of his downfall. That evening, the house felt different. The walls seemed tighter, the air heavier, as if even the silence knew what I was about to do. Brandon walked in with his usual confidence, tossing his keys on the counter like a man with nothing to hide. I watched him from the doorway, my chest tight, my mind a storm. My fingers dug into my arms as I crossed them, holding myself together long enough to speak. "Who's Nancy?" I asked, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. He froze mid-step, the name slicing through his facade. For a moment he looked caught off guard, but then that familiar scoff escaped his lips. "She's lying," he said flatly, waving his hand as if brushing away dust. "Trying to trap me with a baby that isn't mine." His arrogance burned through me, stoking the fire already raging inside. He didn't even flinch at the accusation, didn't even try to soften it. Something in me snapped. My hand slammed down on the dining table, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. "Don't you dare lie to me," I shouted, my throat raw. "She knew things only you could have told her. You betrayed me, Brandon, and then you threatened her?" His jaw clenched, his mask cracking for just a second. I had him cornered, and for the first time, I saw the man behind the mask of my so-called husband. His eyes darkened, and the calmness I once mistook for strength twisted into something menacing. He stepped closer, his voice sharp, laced with fury. "I told her to keep quiet for our marriage's sake," he barked. "Do you think I'll let some desperate girl ruin everything I've built? Everything we have?" His words were dripping with entitlement, as if my life, my marriage, my very dignity were just parts of his empire to protect. I stood my ground, though my legs trembled under the weight of rage and heartbreak. "Our marriage?" I spat, the word tasting like poison on my tongue. "You don't get to use that word. You already tore it apart with your lies. The image of Nancy, crying and begging for help, burned in my mind. His cruelty wasn't just toward me anymore. It had spilled into someone else's life, threatening to swallow her whole. And I couldn't stay silent. His voice rose, his face red, spittle at the corner of his mouth. "You're overreacting. I did what I had to do to protect us, to protect you." His words thundered through the room, but to me, they sounded hollow. They weren't about protection, they were about control. And for the first time, I saw him clearly. A man who wasn't afraid of losing me, but terrified of losing power. I clenched my fists at my sides, every muscle in my body tight with fury. My voice dropped, low and sharp, slicing through his shouting. "No, Brandon, you didn't protect us. You protected yourself. And in doing so, you destroyed everything we had." The words tasted bitter, but they were the truest thing I had ever said to him. His face twisted, caught between rage and panic, but I didn't let him speak. Not this time. He paced the room like a caged animal, muttering under his breath, shaking his head as if denial could rewrite reality. For years, I had accepted his excuses, let him cover lies with charm and half-truths. But tonight, I wasn't the same woman who used to flinch at confrontation. Tonight, I saw him for exactly who he was, and the sight made me stronger. His silence, his anger, his deflections, they were nothing but weapons he had lost the power to use against me. Standing tall, I locked eyes with him, unflinching. My voice was steady, almost calm now. "This ends here, Brandon. You think you can threaten, manipulate, and scare your way out of this? But you're wrong." He opened his mouth, ready to roar back, but I didn't wait. Deep inside, I had already made a choice. This wouldn't be resolved with shouting or tears. It would be resolved with strategy, and I had just the skills to do it. The next morning, I sat at my desk, papers spread out like a battlefield map. Years of practicing law had taught me how to dismantle an argument, how to strip a liar down to their weakest point. But this wasn't just another case. This was personal. Brandon had underestimated me, blinded by his arrogance, and now I was going to use every tool I had to make sure his lies buried him instead of us. Nancy sat across from me, her hands wrapped protectively around her belly. Her eyes flicked nervously to the files and recordings I was compiling. "Are you sure we can win this?" she asked softly, her voice fragile, full of doubt. I looked at her, this young woman who had stumbled into my life with a phone call, and felt the weight of her fear pressing against my resolve. I leaned forward, my voice steady, almost fierce. "Oh, we won't just win. We'll make sure he loses everything. His reputation, his career, even his freedom if the court sees fit." Her lips trembled, and tears welled in her eyes as relief clashed with guilt. She whispered, "Why would you do this for me?" I paused, my throat tightening, but the answer came clear as glass. "Because I refuse to let him keep hurting women. You and I both deserve justice." The evidence came together piece by piece, like shards of glass forming a jagged mirror. Text messages he thought he'd hidden, late-night call logs, and worst of all, the recordings of his threats. Hearing his voice through the playback made my skin crawl, so familiar, yet dripping with venom I hadn't known he was capable of. I organized everything meticulously, every detail lined up to expose the man behind the mask. Nancy sat in silence, watching me work, her face pale but her eyes determined. Every time she glanced at the documents, I saw her pain, but I also saw her strength growing. She wasn't just the frightened girl who had called me that morning anymore. She was becoming someone braver, someone willing to fight for herself and her child. And somehow, that gave me more courage too. At night, when the house was quiet and Brandon pretended life was still intact, I would sit in my office, highlighting sections of transcripts, marking evidence, and drafting strategies. This wasn't just about divorce papers or betrayal anymore. It was about holding him accountable in a way he couldn't wriggle out of. The more I worked, the clearer it became. This fight was bigger than me. When I finally looked up from the mountain of files, Nancy's gaze met mine. Her eyes were wet, but there was a spark in them now, a glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, I shook my head gently. Don't thank me yet. We're only just beginning. But know this, we're not victims anymore. We're the ones in control now. The words steadied me as much as they steadied her. She nodded, clutching her belly, and for a moment the air between us felt almost like solidarity instead of despair. I thought about all the women I'd known, women who had been silenced, dismissed, made to believe their pain didn't matter. Brandon was just one man, but he represented every cruel arrogance I had ever fought against. And this time, I wasn't fighting for a client. I was fighting for myself, too. I gathered the folders into a neat stack, my resolve hardening like steel. Brandon believed he was untouchable, that his threats and charm could shield him forever. But he didn't realize I had built my career on exposing liars just like him. The difference was, this liar had broken my home. And now I was ready to make him pay the price. Court day arrived like a storm I'd been building toward for weeks. I stood before the judge with my stack of evidence feeling both naked and powerful. Nervous, yes, but certain. The courtroom hummed with a low electricity, cameras in the gallery, colleagues murmuring, and Brandon's eyes, cold, arrogant, locked on me as if daring me to fail. When I began to present the timeline, the texts, the recordings, the room narrowed to the sound of my voice and the weight of proof laid bare. Each piece fit together, undeniable, a portrait of a man who threatened, intimidated, and lied. I watched his face as his confident mask frayed, micro-expressions betraying panic he tried desperately to hide. The defense tried theatrics, accusations of fabrication, questions meant to distract, breathless attempts to rewrite the narrative. But the recordings had his voice, the timestamps had his pattern, and witnesses corroborated the late-night calls and threats. I methodically walked the court through his messages, pausing at lines that showed not confusion but calculated intimidation. With every exhibit, the veneer of his authority peeled away, and I felt a fierce satisfaction seeing the scales tip, because we had done our homework, we had done it clean and professional, and the truth was relentless. When I finally finished presenting, there was a hush heavy enough to hold. Brandon rose, red-faced, shouting that it was all lies, that I'd orchestrated this to ruin him. The judge gestured sharply, a cold reminder that courtroom theatrics won't replace evidence. I met Brandon's glare with calm. I didn't need to shout to win. The law was on our side when supported by truth. The next steps would not be decided this instant, but I could feel the tide turning, and with that shift came the beginning of a reckoning none of us would forget. As I stood there, I could feel Brandon's anger burning holes into me, but it only fueled my resolve. The judge leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. The evidence speaks for itself. Those words rang like a bell, cutting through his protests. Brandon tried to laugh it off, a hollow, bitter sound, but even he seemed to realize the performance was collapsing. The courtroom wasn't buying his charm anymore. They were seeing him for who he truly was. I turned back to the bench, steadying my breath. Your Honor, these threats weren't empty. They were meant to silence her, to crush her, and to protect an image built on deception. My words echoed, not loud, but sharp, each one meant to slice through the last layer of denial he was clinging to. I could see jurors shifting in their seats, some exchanging glances, as if they too had finally connected the dots. The mask was gone, and there was no hiding what lay beneath. Brandon slammed his fist against the table, shouting that we were conspiring, that we had twisted everything. But the judge's gavel struck hard, silencing him. For the first time, I didn't see a husband, or even a man in control. I saw someone cornered, stripped of power, desperate to claw back what he had already lost. And in that moment, I realized his downfall wasn't coming. It was already here. I turned to face him one last time, my voice steady, almost cold. You told me once I was the love of your life, but the truth is clear now. You never loved anyone but yourself. His jaw clenched, his hands gripping the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. For years, I had let those words mean something to me, but standing there in that courtroom, they finally lost all their power. The silence that followed was louder than any outburst he could have thrown. The judge announced that the evidence would proceed to a formal ruling, Brandon's professional ties already unraveling as whispers rippled through the gallery. Lawyers who once shook his hand now looked at him with disdain, like a sinking ship they couldn't jump from fast enough. The arrogance that had carried him all these years was stripped bare, leaving nothing but the truth for everyone to see. His empire wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing in front of his eyes. As the session adjourned, I gathered my files with deliberate calm. My knees were trembling, but inside, I felt an unfamiliar strength rooting itself deeper than ever before. Justice wasn't finished, it was still unfolding. But in that moment, I knew the hardest part was over. Brandon's reputation, his career, his false image, they were all crumbling. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to imagine what life could look like beyond him. Weeks later, I found myself back at the Brown Café, the place where this nightmare had first taken shape. But this time, the air didn't feel suffocating. It felt lighter, as though the weight I had carried for so long had finally started to lift. Nancy was already there, sitting by the same window where she'd once confessed everything. Her hand rested gently on her belly, her face softer now, calmer, like she could finally breathe again. When she saw me, her lips curved into a timid smile. "I still feel guilty," she admitted, her voice quiet but steady. "But thank you. You saved me." I slid into the chair across from her, the memory of our first meeting flashing like a scar that no longer bled. "We saved each other," I said, and I meant it, because in the middle of lies and betrayal, we had found something unexpected, strength in solidarity. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine in a gesture of gratitude, and I let the moment linger. For once, there were no tears, no tremors, no fear clouding her eyes. Just hope. And as I looked at her, I realized that while Brandon had tried to break us, what he really did was forge something stronger than either of us had known we possessed. Nancy's smile wavered, and she lowered her gaze to her hands. "Sometimes, I still wonder if this will follow me forever," she murmured. "What if people only see me as the woman who ruined a marriage?" Her voice cracked with the question, and I felt a pang of recognition in my chest. Shame had a way of clinging like smoke. You thought you'd washed it away, but it lingered. I reached across the table, squeezing her hand gently. "They don't get to define you. You're more than one mistake. You're a mother now, and that baby deserves to know the strength it took for you to stand up." Her eyes glistened as she nodded, the weight on her shoulders seeming just a little lighter. The guilt was still there, but so was resilience, and I could see both battling inside her. In a strange way, her struggle mirrored my own. I had wondered for days if I'd ever be able to trust myself again, if I'd ever stop asking how I hadn't seen the truth sooner. But sitting there with her, I realized those questions didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what we chose next. The clatter of cups and soft hum of conversation filled the cafe around us, ordinary life carrying on as if our world hadn't been cracked open. For the first time, I let that ordinary comfort sink in. Maybe healing wasn't about erasing the scars. It was about learning to live with them and still finding reasons to smile. And I wasn't just finding that for myself. I was finding it for her too. Nancy tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What will you do now?" The question lingered between us, heavier than it seemed. I took a slow breath, staring out the window at people strolling past, their lives untouched by mine. "I'll start over," I said, my voice firm. "Alone, but free. And next time, I'll choose a man worthy of me." The words didn't feel like a dream anymore. They felt like a promise I owed myself. Her smile softened, and she nodded, as though she believed in that future for me even more than I did. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, just two women who had walked through fire and come out the other side, scarred, but not destroyed. I realized then that our story wasn't one of rivalry or resentment. It was one of survival, of defiance, and of reclaiming our lives from the grip of one man's cruelty. When I finally rose from the table, I felt lighter than I had in years. I left the cafe with my head held high, the sun warm on my face, each step carrying me farther away from the shadows of betrayal. For the first time, The future didn't terrify me. It called to me. I wasn't the woman who answered that trembling phone call anymore. I was stronger, sharper, and finally free to write the next chapter of my life on my own terms.